Hi everyone and welcome. I am joined today by Ian Proud, a British diplomat who served at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. And after all of these years of war and also the past 3 years of full diplomatic boycotts and with no negotiations, it now seems that it is a possibility to actually have negotiations. Or are we perhaps a bit too optimistic? There seems to be some political theater and publicity stunts going on. Yeah, welcome back to the program. And I was, yeah, wanted to ask you first, what do you make, what sense do you make of the recent developments? That is the coalition of the willing, the Europeans. They put a ultimatum for Russia to accept a ceasefire, which was predictably dismissed right away. Uh, what is the main struggle? Why is it that the Europeans are pushing for a ceasefire before we have any discussions about a political settlement, while the Russians demand a political settlement before a ceasefire?
Yeah, so I mean, it strikes me that the Europeans, working in committee, have no real sense of how to handle Russia. They've put in, they've offered up an ultimatum, but if anybody knew anything about Russia, they'd know that President Putin would never accept that. They've offered to impose massive sanctions, although it isn't really clear after 20,000 sanctions have been imposed already what more they can possibly do. They want a ceasefire now. Well, of course, we'll want a ceasefire. There needs to be talks about the underlying concerns that Russia's had for the past, not 3 years, frankly, for the past 18 years, going right back to the Munich Security Conference speech that President Putin made. And I think actually it's been helpful that Putin has suggested that actually rather than its call for endless, meaningless ceasefires with threats of sanctions, they actually start negotiations for the first time in 3 years. So that's happening in Istanbul. There have been further twists and turns. Zelensky saying he's going to meet Putin personally without any guarantee that President Putin will actually show up, which seems to me a bit of a ruse to hopefully create conditions, for Putin not to show up and Zelensky to say that it's all been a fraud and we need to call it all off and give us more weapons, But fundamentally, we just need to get down to the negotiation phase at this stage in the game. Ukraine isn't winning; it can't impose a strategic defeat on Russia. Let's just start talking and cut a deal.
So Ukraine is in a very tough spot now. We see the yeah all along the front line, especially in the Pokrovsk region. Yeah, the town after town are falling, and so yeah, the Europeans they ask for a 30-day ceasefire without any conditions, and then the Russians counter this by saying we're willing to start talks now in Istanbul, but we want to have this we want a political settlement before we end the fighting. Now, I can understand if I was advising Moscow, I would I would see that the only reason why the Europeans and Ukrainians would accept such harsh concessions would be because this of pressure. If you end the fighting, why would they accept any of these concessions now? And then we have Zelensky saying, yes, we'll have discussions in Istanbul, but it will be Zelensky and Putin. I mean, is this the usually you don't have the presidents opening up the negotiations? Isn't it usually the negotiators who flesh the details out before you elevate it to the next level?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, these talks are meant to happen on Thursday. It's already now Tuesday. I don't think any talks have taken place yet. Whenever a head of state goes to a meeting with another, head of state, there's a heck of a lot of work that goes into the planning of that meeting before it even happens. When you watch it on TV, it all looks so effortless, but actually, normally there's been days and weeks and sometimes months of preparatory negotiations to get to the point where the presidents meet. The idea that Putin and Zelensky are going to bump into each other in Istanbul is slightly bizarre. You could turn it to a positive, in fact. I mean, if in fact they would meet and announce the starting of negotiations, that might not be necessarily a bad thing, in fact. But actually, still, the two delegations need to be talking about that and doing what we call a choreography around that beforehand. It isn't just going to happen. Zelensky isn't going to turn up in Istanbul and say, "Oh, well, Mr. Putin, we're taking our demand for NATO membership off the table. That clearly isn't going to happen. So, these things need to be kind of carefully thought through. Let's get the negotiations started on Thursday in Istanbul. Whether or not President Putin attends, I understand that Foreign Minister Lavrov will be leading, the Russian delegation. If that's true, then that is already a very high level sort of Russian delegation. Let's just get these talks started.
Well, what is the logic though behind starting a ceasefire that there's no starting a ceasefire before the political discussions begin at all? Well, if the logic is that we just need to stop the fighting and not waste any time, before, well, we had 3 years to pick up the phone and call the Russians. Indeed, the Europeans are still not picking up that phone and calling Moscow. So, what is the logic behind wanting to do a ceasefire or demanding an unconditional ceasefire without even, opening up dialogue with the opponents?
Well, they can't be one without the other. Just a ceasefire for the sake of a ceasefire is meaningless. A ceasefire while talks are happening, maybe there's potential to look at that. Of course, but just having a ceasefire for a ceasefire's sake will only raise concerns on the Russian side that Ukraine will use that breathing space to kind of rearm. President Zelensky was asking for 3 million artillery shells during his, visit to Prague last week. There's no signs actually on the Ukrainian side, certainly with President Zelensky, that he wants to give up any lots of Western munitions to carry on the fight to Russia. So on that basis, why just have an empty ceasefire? Let's have proper talks. Maybe there can be a ceasefire while the talks are happening. That might be a sensible idea, but you can't just have a ceasefire without the talks.
Yeah, because you wrote an article about this, and which I would advise everyone to read. And well, you make the point that the new German foreign minister, he just repeated that Ukraine's path to NATO is irreversible. So this is more or less off the table. But this has to be the foundation. This is the main aspect of any peace agreement which Russia would accept. So are the Germans simply removing the most important thing for the Russians for a ceasefire and at the same time asking for an unconditional ceasefire? Uh, are they painting themselves in a corner there though? Because now they either have to fold on, after making grand statements, otherwise, but still they can't move the peace forward unless they are willing to at least open up the discussion on ending NATO's expansionism on Russian borders.
Yeah, absolutely. Most statements made by European leaders over the past 3 years and even before that, have been completely unrealistic. And this latest statement by the new German Foreign Minister is no different to that. NATO membership is an absolute red line for Russia. It has been for very many years, going right back to 2007, as we discussed before. And my understanding is actually that in the first Istanbul Agreement of March 2022, NATO membership was actually conceded as not an option for Ukraine in the future, and I believe that the Ukrainians were ready to sign that deal. The idea that Ukraine's situation has so improved since March 2022 that they can reintroduce NATO as an option for Ukraine when Ukraine's in a weaker position than it was 3 years ago is clearly completely ridiculous. So actually, we need to kind of dial out these unhelpful kind of talking heads in the West and just focus in on Ukraine and Russia having bilateral talks to resolve these underlying concerns, one of which is Ukraine's NATO aspirations, which is unrealistic and should be taken off the table.
And well, you mentioned pick up things where it was left because this is something that the Russians have said that we already have a format for negotiations. That is in the beginning of 2022, we sat down, we had more or less an agreement, which was the Istanbul Agreement. I guess the core of the argument was, or the agreement was that the Ukrainians had to restore their neutrality. So again, no NATO. But obviously, in that agreement, the Russians were pulling back where they were at 2022. But now we had 3 years of war, so now they want, in addition, these four oblasts, which they refer to as recognizing current realities. But uh, where else are they in terms of where they left off? Because Russia now obviously is in a much stronger position than it was in the beginning of 2022. Or what other issues is it there that has to be solved beyond the neutrality and the territorial issue? Because the Ukrainians, of course, they have very legitimate concerns and demands on their own.
Yeah, of course. And there's been a lot of discussion about the de facto recognition of the line of control, wherever that is settled at the end, of the conflict. Both sides presented proposals, European side and the US kind of side, just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, that is really the biggest issue in addition to NATO membership. That is the thing that has changed since March of 2022. Russia has seized and controlled and actually laid claim to additional kind of four oblasts in Ukraine. Well, actually, in fact, two oblasts in Ukraine, because Russia recognized Donetsk and Luhansk right at the start of of the war, of course. But the other issues are kind of very similar, in fact, to what they were. But when the war started, there's the issue of Ukrainian sort of children, what's happened to them. There's the issue for Russian speakers in Ukraine of the recognition of minority languages. It also applies to Hungarian language speakers in Ukraine as well. And these kind of issues around how to tackle kind of allegations of human rights abuses committed by both sides during the course of the war. That's not going to be an issue that's resolved easily or anytime soon. I suspect. I mean, there's a whole list of detailed stuff, but really the two fundamental things are really the issue around neutrality and actually arguably now the trickier issue, which will end up in some messy kind of de facto, acceptance on both sides of the status of the four oblasts, and separate to that, of course, Crimea, where the Americans have tried to sort of force the issue by suggesting they might de jure sort of recognize Crimea as part of Russia.
But the Europeans, I guess it's a strange question, but do they actually want the peace? Because besides refusing to even make any concessions on NATO expansion, they even argue that during a ceasefire, they were quite open that this is an opportunity to rearm Ukraine, and some even speak, the coalition of the willing to put the troops on the ground, but this is all framed as helping a ceasefire, but surely this would sabotage the prospect of a ceasefire, wouldn't it? Or what is what are indications? Because it seems like the war has been lost, and
Yeah.
our that is Europe's and Ukraine's situation will only worsen by the day. So what is the game being played here? If you're only prolonging the war, what is the objective?
Well, a cynic, might suggest that for the European side, it slows down and kicks down the road the hot can of Ukraine's membership of the EU, which is going to be impossible, while war is going on. Of course, Ukrainian membership of the EU, even if it's accelerated, would cause significant internal debates and disruption within European states, especially Poland, actually, which is the largest net beneficiary of European subsidies, and also actually kind of France. So a cynic might look at that. In my view, and I think that's a very real kind of issue. I mean, the longer term Ukraine EU issue is a massively complex task, which has, quite significant consequences potentially for, Europe's kind of integrity as a project, long term. But I mean, in terms of the war itself, too many people, I think, fall into the mistake of thinking that European politicians have some clear strategic plan or goals, for the war in Ukraine. They don't. What we see in terms of European statements is that what I call the analogy of the kind of the chess game, playing chess by committee. There are no clear plans. Everything that the Europeans do and say is governed by them, operating as a committee and coming up with lowest common denominator sort of positions and being unable to kind of shift from those positions over time. So this is just a magnified version of the European consensus on Ukraine that has been in place, since 2014, when the Ukraine crisis started. Uh, the European Union doesn't have the democratic mechanisms or equipment to change course easily. And now it is struggling in the face of a huge pivot, political pivot, forced upon them by by the Americans, and they're unable to cope, and that's actually causing internal frictions within individual EU member states, in particular Germany, France. That's causing this kind of knee-jerk reactions in terms of the lawfare being used against political parties that are more pro-peace, for example, in Romania, in France, in Germany, in other states as well. I mean, the European consensus is unable democratically to change, and as it kind of responds to forces outside of its control, it's resorting to increasingly kind of bizarre actions, which will only accelerate its potential demise. And of course, I hope that doesn't happen as a pro-European, but it's a very, very worrying time. Actually, the best medicine that you can take is to end the war, because the war is only kind of accentuating and accelerating those internal centripetal forces.
Mm. No, it looks as if that's they talked about forever the costs of leaving Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, it seemed also just better to leave and then instead of dragging out the pain, because it does look like just not only NATO, but even the European Union could fall apart as a result
Yes,
of our defeat in this war. But it does seem that the Russians, when they hear this talk about ceasefire without a political settlement, it sounds an awful lot like we've watched this movie before. That is, when you were at the British embassy in Moscow, around this time you had the Ukrainian army being defeated by Donbass in the Bolsova. The Europeans rushed in. This, let's just stop the fighting now, and here's a political settlement. We'll implement it later on, but at least we stop the fighting. But once the fighting was over, the pressure for making these concessions were gone, and suddenly one starts to talk about the spirit of it or how unfair it was, and meanwhile
yes,
changing realities on the ground by pumping in weapons and building up, a Ukrainian army of
yes,
hundreds of
yeah,
thousands. So, even Merkel and Hollande, they admitted to this. Even Poroshenko and Zelensky, that there was no intention of implementing this. So, what can the Europeans do to reassure the Russians that this isn't the Minsk Three and another ruse to simply prolong the war?
Well, I think the difference now to the situation around the Minsk II agreement in February, 2015, is that actually now that the Americans, not the Europeans, are in the driving seat, and the Europeans don't really have a role in this except to kind of chip in unhelpfully from the sidelines. I fear so. Mercifully, actually, the Americans, and we should actually be ashamed of this in Europe, that we're not managing this situation ourselves, that the Americans are, but the Americans are actually forced this issue, not the Europeans. The Americans are more invested than the Europeans in actually seeing it through to a conclusion of the conflict, and we are dependent on the Americans for our, future. Which, if you step back, it is a worrying sort of situation in and of itself. But at least actually in the short term, at least that the war may end. It's difficult to compare this with Minsk too. You're absolutely right that Poroshenko and Zelensky didn't have the political space domestically, to implement that. And it was definitely the case that the Americans and the British, actively encouraged them not to implement, the Minsk II agreement, but nevertheless blame it on Russia, through eternal sanctions and all the rest of it. But I still think that Merkel and Hollande have been slightly disingenuous in repurposing history. I believe at the time they were really committed to this process, but they were completely undercut by the Americans and the British at the time. Now the dynamic has totally changed, and the Germans and the French are no longer leading this process anyway. It's the Americans.
Well, the Europeans, they express a lot of concerns now that they're being left behind, that this is a negotiation being done over their heads by Washington and Moscow. But as I mentioned before, still they don't pick up the phone. And there seems, this aversion to calling Moscow, that somehow this will threaten the isolation of Russia, if there still is such a thing. Uh, but how can you explain this to us again as a as a British diplomat? Why, if they're this concerned about being left behind, but they still don't want to talk to the Russians, and even the initiatives which are being proposed, like you said, this ceasefire, it seems merely yes, theater to get the Americans on board with more sanctions to portray the Russians as not wanting any peace. So how do you make sense of this? Again, the genuine concern that they're left behind, but still talking to the opponent is kind of out of the question.
The only way out of any conflict without total military victory is through dialogue between the two sides, and that's Ukraine and Russia. It has been an explicit, certainly an explicit British foreign policy approach since 2014 that we would not engage directly with Russia in dialogue. That engaging with Russia in dialogue would simply somehow reward Russia for Russia's behavior. We had this slightly kind of bizarre adult Karl's way of analyzing transactions with the Russians, that because we were larger, collectively, theoretically, than Russia, that Russia was like a badly behaved child, and we wouldn't talk to Russia until Russia had changed its ways. Now, clearly, 11 years on, that approach has failed, but we haven't changed. We still continue to believe that actually, we can not talk to Russia and somehow bring peace to Ukraine, when very manifestly, we cannot do that. We don't have the economic and the military means, to do that. We can't defeat, Russia. The only way out is dialogue. To complain, that we have no role in the negotiations, while at the same time refusing to talk to Russia, is patently absurd. And that's why we've been undercut by, President Trump. He's come in a new kid on the block. He's not new. He's obviously there before, between 2017 and the start of 2021. But I mean, he's able as a fresh face to totally change the direction of policy, and he's done that. And we're left, sort of in the choppy waters in the wake, trying not to drown.
I also wanted to ask you about the Russian position because obviously they're starting off, given that they're in a very strong position, they can be quite demanding. Of course, I think the neutrality issue and the territorial, at least the territory they're holding, is beyond negotiation. But if the possibility of an actual peace emerging in which they get something in return, like recognition or an end to NATO expansionism, what do you think the Russians are willing to do in terms of concessions? Do you think they're willing to limit some of the, I guess, territorial demands, given that they don't actually control all the territories they're demanding? Are they willing to, I don't know, give up on some of the demands that the Ukraine has to be demilitarized? I mean, where is the room for maneuver here? Because they have to have calculated the willingness
Mm.
at some point to give something.
Yeah. I mean, before we got the position we're in today, when breakthrough seemed possible about 3 weeks ago, when Trump was really kind of pushing the negotiations, there were suggestions from the Russian side that they would be willing to not press their claim for the remaining territory in the four oblasts that they've laid claim to, and just to accept the de facto line of control going into the future. So that was a sign that Russia had recognized that actually it's far better to cut a deal, than to continue with its maximalist positions. And in any negotiations, in any case, you always start with a totally optimistic position and end up somewhere that you can live with, right? I mean, that's just how negotiations take place. I mean, the fundamental issues are really the NATO membership and just the recognition issue. The other things they might concede, there's been talk about the potential use of the frozen Russian assets as part of reconstruction, both within Ukraine itself, but within those parts of Ukraine that are currently occupied, by the Russian side. Russia has kind of hinted a willingness to look at that as well. For example, so I get the sense that actually Russia is willing to kind of meet somewhere in the middle on the demilitarization issue. Even in the first Istanbul agreement back in 2022, there were agreements on that Ukraine could have a military, but some limits were set on the size of the military. I think is 80,000 troops at the time, which by the way is bigger than the British Army. Just putting that out there. That may be different now. I mean, Ukraine is a military of apparently 1 million people now. I mean, it can't afford to maintain that longer term, but there have to be some discussions on the shape of the Ukrainian military. Clearly, the disposition of foreign military forces is another kind of big sticking point around this kind of coalition of the willing, so-called troops. But we're quickly getting into the details here, actually, and some of these things will be negotiated over weeks and months. But I mean, I think the big ticket issues, once they're lined up, the sort of territorial disposition of the line of control and the NATO issue. I mean, that could quickly lead to a ceasefire with a longer term process going into the kind of the trickier sort of detailed topics over the coming months.
Yeah. Well, for me, the shameful part of this whole thing is that there hasn't been any diplomacy again for 3 years. That we haven't sat down. We should have been
Yeah.
talking all this time. So I appreciate how your article finished. That either even if they meet Putin and Zelensky, at least if it at least to start negotiations, just at least something to start talking. Because this idea of not rewarding the opponent by talking to them and setting conditions for talks, it's very, very destructive. But it looks like there's some problems, like even like let's say Putin and Zelensky would meet. Would it be possible to meet in Turkey? I can see why the negotiating team can meet there, but for Russian president to go to a NATO country now, would it, given that NATO is seen as a leading aggressor in this by Russia, how how, again, this seems like one of the problems when you set up
Yeah.
a presidential meeting 2, 3 days in advance. But what is uh,
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, Turkey isn't a signatory to the Rome Statute on the ICC, for example, so that issue would fall away. Erdogan has met, Putin since the war started. He met him at the Kazan sort of BRICS, summit, last year. From that point of view, I feel that actually, arrangements could be put in place which are acceptable to the Russian side. But I mean, it's like in 2 days' time, from now. Then you turn around a presidential meeting that quickly. I mean, I know from having worked with the Russians, they like to have all the details worked out, and any any presidential visit, any even prime ministerial visit requires a lot of detailed planning, that right down to the cars they use, everything. So I mean, whether they can turn that around in enough time is questionable. But I mean, they just need to get on with talking. Whether they meet on Thursday, whether they meet in a month's time to sign some agreement that has been negotiated between officials, they just need to start talking.
well, I guess my last question is what do you make of it? The Zelensky offer. Is it just a publicity stunt, or would there be some? What would they talk about? We've put all the inability of Putin to even make it because they can't put the security measures in place, all of these things. But if they actually would, let's say Putin would get on a plane and they fly to
Hmm.
Istanbul and pick up the pieces where they were abandoned 3 years ago. What could actually be achieved in such a meeting besides being more, I guess, almost a ceremony to open up negotiations? So could there be anything else achieved?
No, I mean, I tend to think that a lot of things that Zelensky does are publicity stunts. I worry that he's put this out there, believing that Putin will refuse it and he can call the whole thing off and blame it all on Russia. I mean, I do think that's a major risk here. They couldn't, in all reality, I don't think, achieve much on the first meeting beyond launching, a peace process and negotiations. They could even together agree a ceasefire while those negotiations are happening. I think that could be a positive thing. I don't think Zelensky's going to turn up before any negotiations have happened and immediately concede on NATO, immediately concede on the territorial issues and de facto recognition. He's just not going to do that. I mean, nothing about his behavior over the past 3 years has suggested that he will do that. So the best that this could achieve will be to open a negotiation and agree a ceasefire while that's happening. But then you ask, well, why don't they meet when the negotiations have happened? And there's a deal to be signed, but it's all brinkmanship as far as I can see it. I mean, I hope that the two sides will agree a format where delegations can come together and talk. and start this long overdue sort of process of dialogue to end this frankly needless war.
I agree with that sentiment. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. This is a very confusing time to observe
Confusing
3 years
indeed.
of no talking now. The presidents have to meet in 2 days, otherwise
Well,
we don't
it's
won't meet
11
you at
years of
all.
it's 11 years of no talking. I mean, the British
Yeah,
have not been talking to Russia for 11 years. So I mean, this is not a this is just the latest manifestation of not talking to Russia, which has ended us in this terrible mess we found ourselves in today.
I agree. Well, thanks again.
Cheers, Glenn. Nice to talk to you again.